Returning to the tale of British Leyland, we pick up following the issue of the largely unsuccessful Rider Report and the part nationalisation of the car maker by the government in 1975, the situation continuing to look increasingly bleak by the middle of the decade, thanks to its highly publicised mixture of poor quality products, woeful industrial relations, management incompetence, and the fact that no matter how much money was being poured into the firm, no progress or improvements appeared to emerge, leading the car-buying public and the taxpayer to show ever more hostility towards the nation's largest automaker, while at the same time seeing its market share drop month after month, as customers moved in their thousands to rivals from America, Europe and Japan. In January 1976, a new face arrived within the ranks of the National Enterprise Board, an arm of the government which provided financing to large UK state-owned enterprises, including British Leyland, named Michael Edwards, a South African-born businessman who had seen work with the British battery manufacturer Chloride from 1951 before becoming general manager of one of the firm's operating companies, the Redditch-based Alkaline Batteries, during 1966. Edwards, who had built himself a strong reputation by helping to ensure the survival of alkaline batteries when its market share collapsed as the UK entered the common market, dismissing the recommendations of the Rider Report as merely advice, and considered that these suggestions would simply not work in the case of the British car giant, while at the same time, the BL management was taken to task by the new Minister for Trade and Industry, Eric Varley, who was determined that no more blank cheques would be written for British Leyland unless genuine improvements were noted within the firm, the trade unions responding by upping strike action within the company to its highest levels ever during that year, with serious stoppages being experienced at Llanelli, Canley, Solihull, Drews Lane, Browns Lane, Longbridge and Cowley, the first 5 months of 1976 seeing a cumulative loss in production of 60,000 cars, while union leaders continued to convince themselves that the only way to best serve the workers was to bring the industry to its knees, average production for a British Leyland line worker standing at a meagre 7 cars per employee, compared to a Detroit line worker exhibiting a figure of 18 cars per employee, and Japan exhibiting a staggering 38 cars per employee. The worst strike of them all was the toolmakers' strike of early 1977, which crippled production for 2 of the company's most notable models, the Rover SD1, which was launched in February of that year, and the pre-existing Leyland Princess of March 1975, the former being the most egregious loss for the company, as despite the car being greeted with overwhelming critical acclaim, receiving the only instance of a British Leyland model winning the European Car of the Year award in 1977, the strike meant output for these machines was reduced to a dribble, and thus not enough units could be shipped to dealers so as to satisfy the huge interest of potential customers, this being most notable in continental Europe, where thousands of would-be buyers arrived at British Leyland dealerships, hoping to procure the Ferrari Daytona-styled executive saloon, only to leave empty-handed when the salesmen were forced to admit that they had no cars to sell, leading them straight into the arms of their rivals at Mercedes and BMW, while in the case of the Leyland Princess, what cars were actually being built by the company left the factory in a shambolic state thanks to a lack of quality control, thereby resulting in the Princess, with its especially complex and highly sensitive hydrogas suspension units, suffering from leaks in the cylinders and pipework that would leave the car in a notoriously lopsided position. Despite pleas from the management to end the strike, which came in the form of a handwritten letter sent to every member of the workforce, the industrial action continued through the spring of 1977, and with the cost to the taxpayer ballooning due to lost production, Farley stated that financial aid to British Leyland by the government would cease until the management could get the trade unions under control, thus seeing 2 incredibly worrying prospects, in that it may have resulted in the outright cancellation of the upcoming ADO 88 mini replacement project, but also a serious consideration by the NEB that, due to the drain the firm was having on the taxpayer, British Leyland would be wound up in its entirety, regardless of the incredible damage it would inflict on the UK economy, as well as the estimated 1 million people across the nation who would be left out of work because of its collapse, the strike finally ending after 4 months, but losing the firm approximately £15 million during this period. The truth of the matter was that the strikes at British Leyland were all part of a wider disruption in worker relations across the UK industry, culminating in what was known as the Winter of Discontent during late 1978 and early 1979, wherein strike action being incurred initially in the private sector, but later the public sector, left the nation crippled, thanks largely to the continued emboldening of the Trades Union Congress, or TUC, and the influence it had over state policy, with TUC members, including those within the car industry, being able to dictate terms to the management and essentially hold companies hostage with the threat of strike action, a not too uncommon sight being general managers of the firm working from claustrophobic, untidy offices, while trade union leaders, such as shop stewards, were appointed lavishly furnished rooms with leather sofas, shag pile carpeting, wood panelling, and all the latest technology and creature comforts, strikes during the Winter of Discontent, including those at Ford, who demanded an increase in their wage, an unofficial walkout by the gravediggers of Liverpool and Tameside near Manchester, which left the recently deceased unburied, refuse collectors that resulted in rubbish overflowing in the streets, and an NHS ancillary workers picket that demanded non-accident and emergency patients be turned away. All this being combined with one of the worst winters experienced since the Big Freeze of 1963, with temperatures dropping to as low as -3 degrees, while heavy snowfall crippled major transport corridors. Though a 3-month ceasefire was agreed following the end of the toolmakers' strike, Farley refused to grant the BL management's request for £100 million in aid due to their pitiful ongoing performance, the Ryder plan's credibility at redressing the balance at the company being so undermined that Ryder himself resigned as chairman of the NEB in August 1977, thus leading to Leslie Murphy being moved into the position, who offered to Michael Edwards 2 months later the opportunity to take an appointment as chairman of British Leyland, to which he accepted in less than 30 seconds. Edwards being considered to have the strength of character necessary to take on the unions, as well as making harsh decisions regarding cutbacks so as to strip as many losers from the company books as possible, though Edwards was, in truth, not made an employee of British Leyland, but instead had simply been seconded from his current employer at Chloride for a fixed-term contract of 3 years with options for renewal. His rise to the position of chairman on November 1, 1977, not being greeted with universal acceptance, with general manager Alex Park resigning on the same day, followed within weeks by managing director Derek Whittaker, while the unions intended to immediately baptize Edwards with fire amid his initial motions as to downscaling certain operations to cut overhead. The battleground for Edwards' confrontation with the trade unions was at Speke on Merseyside, a Triumph facility established in 1959 as part of the government's scheme to resolve pervasive unemployment in economically deprived areas, this factory having been expanded at a cost of £10 million in 1970 so as to allow for production figures of 100,000 cars per annum to be achieved, Edwards making public his intentions to streamline operations at Speke by moving production of the brand new TR7 sports car to Triumph's main plant at Canley near Coventry, to which the notoriously unruly workforce ordered an immediate sit-in at the factory that obstructed all work, with the Canley plant also staging a sit-in out of solidarity for their fellow employees. Edwards responding by issuing an ultimatum in February 1978, after 17 weeks of strikes, that he would close the factory completely if the shop stewards didn't restart production, a threat taken as a bluff and thus not heeded, leading, inevitably, to the closure of Speke 1 month later, with thousands left out of work, the trade unions coming off as the overall losers of the confrontation, as it robbed them of their previously unbroken ability to hold the management to ransom, although Edwards also came off bloodied, as the closure of Speke meant production of the TR7 had to be halted and transferred to Canley, just as the car was being launched on the American market, thus seeing its much-anticipated release in the United States completely undermined, while also sacrificing the £10 million investment in the new 1970 Speke facility that had barely been paid off, and, most importantly of all, the Triumph Lynx, a V8-powered coupe version of the TR7 that could have potentially been the saviour for the entire scheme, but had to be axed in its entirety due to a lack of building capacity at Canley to create both the Lynx and the regular TR7 models. Though the closure of Speke was one that filled the Labour government with worry, with Edwards being summoned to Downing Street by Prime Minister James Callaghan in order to explain himself, the new chairman was determined to make his presence felt within the firm, especially to the trade unions, initially seeing some success in February 1978, when he laid out plans to save the company through essential cuts to a delegation of 720 shop stewards, union and employee representatives, to which a subsequent ballot backed him with a majority of 715 to 5, and thereby illustrating their confidence in Edwards' leadership, with him even receiving a standing ovation from the line workers when he took a tour of the Longbridge plant. But this honeymoon period rapidly waned as the trade unions returned to their militant ways, with strike action becoming their first option rather than their last resort, even though the reality was that 99% of the workforce simply wanted to do their job, but were being accosted by the 1% that staunchly supported the actions of the ever-defiant unions, the loss of up to 250,000 cars worth of production for 1977 alone, leading Edwards to turn his campaign directly against the shop stewards, who were ultimately responsible for calling the strikes, as well as an epidemic of theft that saw mechanical parts, pieces of trim, and even paint from the paint shops stolen by the workers for either their own use or resale, with the not too uncommon sight of finding houses, bedrooms, and even garden sheds painted in the colour schemes of British Leyland's product lineup. With Edwards willing to use anything and everything at his command to upturn the grip of the trade unions, his attention rapidly turned to its notorious figurehead, Derek Robinson, who had joined Austin as an apprentice at Longbridge during World War II and had been a prominent figure of the trade union at the plant throughout the decades, rising to the rank of Communist Union convener at the factory during 1975, Robinson being more in favour of the conclusions of the Ryder Report, in that rather than shutting factories, the company should just build more cars, regardless of how many or how few they sold. His support from the Longbridge assembly staff having been on the wane for some time by the end of the 1970s, as due to him becoming the face of the striking car workers through his incredibly publicised rallies, he was now portrayed in the media as either an anti-hero who had seen his power over the unions wrestled from him by more militant underlings, or a once well-intentioned man now deluded with power who was seeking to destroy the industry, earning him the infamous name of Red Robbo, Edwards ultimately taking the fight to Robinson in November 1979, when a vote conducted among the Longbridge workforce showed unanimous support for him being relieved of his duties, while a sign as to his loss of influence within the company ranks was illustrated in a follow-up sympathy strike in February 1980. As while the vote to walk out had won with a majority of 14,000 to 600, most of those who turned up in support of Robinson were not men of the production line, but instead were radical left-wing activists who shared his political affiliations and were largely not involved with British Leyland itself. With Edwards, who had been knighted for services to British commerce as part of the Queen's birthday honours in 1979, appearing to have now triumphed over the unions, his attention turned to the matter of cutting overhead wherever he could, as British Leyland's market share dropped to a meagre 24.3% in the UK, starting with a slew of factory closures, including the MG plant at Abingdon on October 22, 1980, and the Triumph Home factory of Canley 4 days later. Though more controversial was the shutting of the nearly new SD1 assembly lines at Solihull, which had only been opened in 1975 at a cost of £31 million. The cumulative redundancy, as per Edwards' strict new policies, being the loss of 90,000 jobs, while in the midst of plant cuts, the corporate structure was reorganised once again to dispense with the flawed division system of the Ryder Report, which were instead reorganised into the Special Products Division, Leyland Trucks and Buses, International, and the Motor Division, essentially a facsimile of what Donald Stokes had envisaged at the beginning of the decade, but undertaken in a far more decentralised manner, with Edwards ensuring that, with the exception of the Trucks and Buses Division, the Leyland mark would be removed from all products, as he felt there was no place for such a name except on service vehicles, the shambolic badge engineering policy also being abandoned, as by the turn of the 1980s it had become so confused that the differences between Austin and Morris badged cars were so minimal that there was no reason as to why a customer would buy either in the hope of getting an improved model over the other. The direction Edwards took being to have individual models for individual marks, such as the Morris Marina and Austin Allegro, while those models already being badge engineered would simply fall under their own brand, as was the case with the 1800 and 2200, which was officially marketed from 1978 as the Princess. Though Edwards was spending 60% of his time addressing industrial relations, while a comparative German manager would only spend 5%, he was able to carve out a few hours here and there for the development of new cars to replace the Allegro, the Marina, the Maxi, the Dolomite, and most importantly the Mini, his priority being placed on two upcoming models, the ADO 88 and the LC10, the ADO 88 being a Mini replacement that would ultimately come to pass as the Austin Metro, although due to reservations among the management as to the Mini's continued stellar performance in the marketplace, Edwards was forced to compromise with a decision somewhat antithetic to his policy of reducing internal competition by having the Metro and Mini on sale in parallel, essentially meaning there would be two models sitting in the Super Mini price bracket competing with each other, thus leading to the inevitable robbing of sales from the new Metro by the Mini, and seeing it ultimately fail to become a viable successor to the now 20-year-old car, while the LC10 was conceived as a replacement for the Morris Marina, that was soon expanded to include a saloon version dubbed the LC8 that would replace the Princess. Edwards, in his bid to seek state funding to bring these models to fruition, being forced to face off with the highly sceptical Conservative government of newly elected Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who had made it abundantly clear as part of her campaign that taxpayer money being injected into inefficient industries would be slashed, Edwards being able to convince Thatcher to invest in British Leyland through assurances that the LC8 and LC10, upon their proposed launch date of 1982, would be the last word in quality build, his arguments countered by the terrible reality of the company's market share having dropped for the first time below 20% during 1980. Sadly, slow progress was made on developing the LC8 and LC10, which had been renamed to the LM10 and LM11, thus forcing Edwards to demand rapid facelifts and reworkings to the original product lineup so as to carry the business over until their release, leading to the development of the Morris Ital and the Austin Ambassador as hasty amendments to the Morris Marina and Princess ranges, while the Austin Allegro underwent an extensive revision that essentially rebuilt the car from the ground up, although it became rapidly evident to the BL management that forward planning could not be sustained on astute financial doctrines and cost-cutting alone, with Edwards and NEB chairman Leslie Murphy drafting a shortlist of potential corporate partners with which to share the fiscal burden of developing new models. Potential collaborators including Alfa Romeo, the American Motors Corporation or AMC, BMW, Chrysler of America and Chrysler UK, Fiat, Ford, General Motors, Honda, Mazda, Mercedes-Benz, Mitsubishi, Nissan, the Peugeot Citroën Group, Renault, Saab, Subaru, Toyota, Volkswagen and Volvo, Honda being eventually chosen as the most suitable, as due to the incredible reliability and functionality of the new Pacific metal arriving on the streets of the continent in the UK. Various European nations had implemented stiff limitations on the number of Japanese cars that could be sold in their countries, with Italy demanding that a maximum of only 2,000 Japanese cars could be sold per year in their nation, while France, through an unofficial agreement with the Japanese car makers, stated that their imports should not exceed 3% of the French market share per annum, meaning that builders such as Nissan, Mitsubishi, Honda and alike were seeing their profits strangled on the much sought-after European market. With Honda more than happy to form an alliance with British Leyland, a formal contract between the two firms was signed on Boxing Day 1979, and in 1981 the first collaborative model built between Honda and British Leyland emerged in the form of the Triumph Acclaim, essentially a rebadged Honda Ballad saloon that was built on the former Austin Maxi assembly lines at Cowley, and rapidly went on to become the most reliable product in British Leyland's arsenal, with a record low in warranty claims, Edwards having the foresight to realise that the agreement with Honda could easily be expanded beyond just a single model, and thus altered the terms so that an entire range of joint-built cars could be assembled, Honda being tasked with providing basic models and their respective parts in exchange for their ability to open a new UK production facility in Swindon, the stipulations of the deal being that Honda would not sell the original variants of British Leyland products in the UK, but would take a cut of the profits being garnered by the likes of the Acclaim and its successors, the timing of the Honda-Leyland agreement being exceptional, as with over £2 billion of investment having been made by the preceding governments into the ailing British car firm, the Thatcher cabinet was only days away from wrapping up the builder in its entirety when Edwards, through his strong acumen, was able to convince the Prime Minister that the Honda deal, together with the LM10 and LM11 hatchback and saloon models, would be enough to make British Leyland self-sufficient, and thus led to an additional £990 million of state funding being provided. It was at this point that privatisation soon became the main policy of British Leyland's future, introducing new cars and fiscal policies that would make the car builder a quality item and thus attract a potential buyer, although Sir Michael Edwards would unfortunately not be present to oversee this vital process, as due to his many confrontations with Thatcher over the potential closure of the firm, and disagreements regarding its sale into the private sector, she chose not to renew his secondment contract from Chloride when it expired in 1982, thus seeing Edwards ousted from the position of chairman in September of the same year, and replaced by the quiet but financially proficient Sir Austin Bide, who operated British Leyland part-time alongside his other commitments to the pharmaceuticals group Glaxo, the further segmentation of the motor car division between the mass production element and Jaguar, as each sector was provided additional autonomy in preparation for privatisation, seeing the British Leyland title dropped in favour of the name Austin-Rover, though sectorisation was seen with great distrust by the trade unions, who saw it merely as a means of cutting off the integrated connection between the sectors and allow for their easier sale to third parties, suspicions that were confirmed when Jaguar was floated on the London Stock Exchange in 1984, prior to its sale back into private industry, despite the fact that, of British Leyland's assets, Jaguar was the only one with any chance of garnering any potential buyers, as the Austin-Rover division continued to rumble along with a derisory value. Elsewhere, the success of the Triumph Acclaim, as a reliable tie-up between Honda and British Leyland, led rapidly on to a new member of this agreement being released in the form of the Rover 213, the move of what was essentially a mid-size family car into the executive Rover mark, with the Triumph brand being dropped entirely during 1984, being considered a poor move, as not only was the 213 the smallest Rover put on sale since the Rover 10 of 1927, but it also served to dilute the prestigious mark by raising a question within the buying public as to why they should purchase a far more expensive Rover 213 when the Honda Ballad, off which it was based, was also on sale at a lower price, while the continued agreement between Honda and Austin-Rover, which now proposed an entire slew of new cars including a high-end executive model to replace the SD1, called Project XX, invoked the ire of the European community, with Jacques Carvet, head of Peugeot, describing Britain as a Japanese aircraft carrier off the coast of Europe, the response of Harold Musgrove, head of the Austin-Rover division, demanding that these criticisms be dispelled by ensuring that 90% of the Rover 213 was built in Britain, although ultimately he had to concede a more realistic figure of 80%, including the use of a 2.5-litre Honda V6 engine and gearbox, together with much of the ancillary componentry. Meanwhile, the British-developed LM10 and LM11 remained elusive as delays continued to be incurred, a desperate Musgrove demanding that Austin-Rover Director of Design, David Back, the man behind two of British Leyland's most successful cars, the Range Rover and the Rover SD1, tidy up the LM11 and present an attractive saloon car that would compete with the likes of the Ford Sierra and the Vauxhall Cavalier, his hastily drafted response being of such hideousness that Back was fired on the spot and replaced by ex-Chrysler UK Director of Automotive Design, Roy Axe, who was instrumental in developing the trend-setting Chrysler Voyager minivan, though his involvement came far too late to make any difference to the final design of the LM10 or LM11, and thus he was assigned to work on Project XX instead, his appointment within the ranks of Austin-Rover not just being to design cars, but also to refurbish the company's design facilities, which, to his horror, he found had not been updated since at least 1970, requiring a £5.2 million upgrade programme. Such expenditure being a hot topic at a common select committee held in 1983 that sought to determine the potential timescale for Austin-Rover to break even, Sir Austin Bide stating that the firm was set to reach profit by the time of the LM10's launch in 1984 and would be ready for privatisation soon afterwards. His words not referring to Austin-Rover, but instead Jaguar, as this element of the firm had been revolutionised since 1980 by the tireless work of Chairman John Egan and was now reaping huge profits, while Austin-Rover, in reality, wasn't expected to reach break-even until 1987, a fact Bide kept secret from the Select Committee so as to exaggerate the value of the firm, using Jaguar as a smokescreen of success whenever possible to hide the main inefficiencies of the wider group. Eventually, the LM10 was launched in March 1983 as the Austin Maestro, ending 8 years of fragmented development, the response of the buying public to this new hatchback being one of resounding ambivalence, as the car's style and design was clearly the product of late 70s thinking, with its initial sales burst of 101,000 units during its first full year, dropping off rapidly by 1985, while the LM11, dubbed the Austin Montego, entered the scene in April 1984 after yet another redesign, and during its full year sold 95,000 examples, with Austin-Rover, desperate to get as many units sold as possible, offering discount rates for fleet market buyers who employed the Montego as either company cars, taxis, VIP transports for the Ministry of Defence and government agencies, or as patrol cars for police constabularies. The company's sales performance now split between the highly successful Honda-based Rover 213 and the underwhelming Austin Maestro and Montego, thus leading to a severe reappraisal of how much market share the firm could potentially occupy in the UK, management figures suggesting that Austin-Rover should aim to maintain 18.6% of the market, as their original objective of 20% was now well and truly out of the question, though such decision-making did little to quell the wrath of the Thatcher government, who had been promised complete success by Sir Michael Edwards, but were now being presented yet another pair of dismal failures. Compounded further when, for 1984, the proposed year of break-even instead resulted in a taxable loss of £73.3 million, Thatcher subsequently declaring open season on the breakup of Austin-Rover, while ignoring the explanations of Sir Austin Bide that strike action at Longbridge was to blame, which had cost the firm 60,000 cars worth of production. With company output running at only 423,000 cars per year, against an expected break-even for an independent car firm of at least 435,000 cars per year, the analysts of the Thatcher cabinet undertook an audit of Austin-Rover's most profitable parts, the first to go being the firm's component division, Unipart, which had reported a profit of £14 million for the 1984 fiscal year, the loss-making aspects of Unipart being subsequently offloaded to within Austin-Rover itself prior to its sale into private industry, while proposals to slash £250 million of corporate spending by the firm through the abandoning of the upcoming K-Series small engine was stopped by Harold Musgrove, who correctly insisted that the radical small power unit would be necessary to replace an ever-present slew of engines that dated back to the days of BMC, as well as ensuring that not every one of the proposed Austin-Rover models were powered by units supplied by Honda, the deficit being made up through the slashing of a proposed Metro replacement due for launch in 1987, whose place was taken by a facelifted Rover 200 due for launch in 1989, though it was at this point that elements within the Thatcher government truly became carried away with their breakup of the firm, as behind the Prime Minister's back, a deal was brokered to sell Land Rover, one of the most consistently profitable parts of the former British Leyland, to General Motors for £275 million, alongside Leyland trucks and buses, Thatcher only becoming aware of this deal on the very day it was being signed, and demanded that Land Rover be removed from the agreement, fearing a public backlash in a manner similar to when Westland Helicopters, Britain's last helicopter manufacturer, was offered for sale to Sikorsky Aircraft of the United States in January 1986, thereby causing the entire agreement to break down. However, while one scandal was avoided, another rapidly emerged, this being caused when Thatcher courted Ford as to potentially buying the more unprofitable sectors of Austin-Rover, Ford seeing this as a golden opportunity to remove models that overlapped with their own range, while also seeing significant value in the upcoming K-Series engine, which was far more advanced than any of Ford's contemporary power units, as well as the various marques including Rover, Mini, MG and Triumph, all of which fell under the intellectual rights of what was formerly British Leyland. The merger of the company and acquisition of the Longbridge and Cowley plants, meaning Ford would have a production capacity of 500,000 additional cars per year, while also inheriting from Austin-Rover their 17.9% share of the UK market and 3% share of the European market, which, in combination with Ford's own 27% UK and 11.9% European market shares, would make them undoubtedly the biggest car brand in Europe above the Volkswagen Audi group, although in the end, the public relations scandal Thatcher had hoped she'd avoided only months earlier re-emerged when it was made public that Britain's last volume car maker was to be sold to the Americans, leading to the deal collapsing within 24 hours of the announcement, despite Ford's promises to uphold the terms of the agreement, Ford ultimately being winners of the situation regardless, as thanks to due diligence provided them as a prospective buyer, they were allowed access to all of Austin-Rover's sensitive information and finance books, that meant they came off knowing vast amounts of commercially valuable details. The two successive bloody noses given to the Thatcher government, meaning her wrath would embrace several members of the executive staff, with Sir Austin Bide, together with both Harold Musgrove and Ray Horrocks, all being relieved of their duties, the role of chairman for Austin-Rover being Graham Day, former chairman of British Shipbuilders, and a man who had overseen the rapid privatisation of that firm during 1982. Frustrated by the continued problems caused by Austin-Rover, Thatcher demanded that the company be privatised as soon as possible, with the British Leyland name, in an official capacity, finally meeting its end during late 1986, when it was replaced by the new corporate brand of the Rover Group, which got off to a strong start with the long-awaited launch of Project XX during July of the same year, which entered sales as the Rover 800, a car that owed almost all of its mechanics to the Honda Legend, and was styled to generally follow the acclaimed looks of the preceding Rover ST1, enthusiasm for the car in both the UK and Europe being highly supportive, but not entirely without problems, as due to supply chain issues, the new M16 engine could not be delivered in quantities that would allow for a mass release, and thus as much emphasis was placed in the marketing for the Honda V6-powered 825 model, although once this hurdle was overcome, sales began to pick up, and the Rover 800 would become something of a darling within the executive segment, being especially popular among managers of business and trade, as well as worming its way into the hearts of the fleet market for company cars, the 800 more often than not, outselling the Ford Granada, which by this point was a household name within the UK, though despite the situation by 1986 being more favourable than it had been at the beginning of 1980, with the firm downsized and streamlined significantly, Day was acutely aware that the Rover Group was backed against a wall when it came to any additional cuts, which would require eating away at the genuinely profitable elements of the business, while annual output was now stuck at only 500,000 cars per year. In this regard, Day opted to push the Rover brand up market as much as possible, so as to appeal to a more sophisticated clientele that sat above Ford and Vauxhall, hitting its two rivals hardest in their much-needed executive brackets, with the Granada and Carlton respectively, though raising the prestige of the Rover Group wasn't the easiest of tasks, as it still had far too many ties to the mass production sector that couldn't be easily severed without losing a huge chunk of the company's income, nor could they be moved into the executive sector, as they had been purpose-built for low-end mass assembly, the Mini being by far its highest seller, while the Metro wasn't matching the Mini for commercial performance, but was selling enough units to remain sustainable, and the Maestro and Montego had fallen rapidly off the radar and were being supported solely by fleet contracts. Market share for the Rover Group hitting its lowest ever figure of 15.9%, and thus forcing Day to rationalise the future direction of the firm through simply promoting the Rover, MG and Land Rover marques, while the Austin name was dropped, and those cars formerly sold under that brand were marketed solely under their own model names, Mini, Metro, Maestro and Montego, all this occurring at a time when the Rover management was still trying to reorganise the firm into a manner that would make it, even at surface level, appear to be a quality item worth purchasing by a private investor. In the end, a chance encounter between Graham Day and chairman of British Aerospace Professor Roland Smith at a cocktail party, in the presence of several government representatives, led rapidly to the drafting of a £150 million purchase offer being made for the Rover Group in March 1988, a move that caught city analysts and rival car firms completely by surprise, the stipulations of the buyout deal including up to £400 million of debt being written off, a £547 million government subsidy being thrown in as working capital, and that BAE could not sell on the car maker to a third party for a minimum of 5 years. The total cost to the UK taxpayer, between the part nationalisation of British Leyland in 1975 and its sale to BAE in 1988, being £2.6 billion. Questions as to why a company that specialised in the building of commercial airliners and supplying military contracts would want to purchase a mass-production car maker being answered in that the sale of Rover to BAE dispelled fears as to the company being bought by a foreign corporation, enforced further by counterbids on the Rover Group made by Ford and Volkswagen, despite offering far better prices than British Aerospace, being blocked outright by the government. Professor Smith making a commitment to invest a sum of at least £1 billion into the Rover Group over the course of its ownership, though there were some concerns within the European Commission, who were reviewing the buyout, regarding the fact that BAE, as a nationalised corporation, was essentially bringing the Rover Group back under state ownership by proxy, and thus they issued a series of conditions, the most important of which was that Rover were required to maintain £100 million of its debts and use its own money to finance car stocks, rather than basing it on government subsidies via BAE. While Professor Smith had his reservations as to the overtly close monitoring of the deal by the European Commission, he was determined to run Rover in whatever manner he saw fit, and despite further comments from Brussels as to the possible scrapping of the previous corporate plan, as outlined by Graham Day in 1986, they eventually granted the deal their blessing on July 13, 1988, and Rover Group fell into the hands of British Aerospace, thus bringing an end to state ownership. The announcement of the sale to BAE, when it was made public in March 1988, boosting morale and stock prices in the firm, with financial figures for the 1987 fiscal year illustrating that, in the weeks following the announcement, Rover Group made a profit before tax of £27.9 million, numbers which gave the city analysts and banks cause for comfort as to the future stability of the firm going into the 1990s.